There are certain moments in a person's life when the noise of everything they have built suddenly goes completely quiet. Not because the world has stopped moving, but because something closer to home has shifted in a way that forces a reckoning with what truly matters. For Chip Gaines, that moment arrived not on a television set, not in a boardroom, and not in the middle of one of his famously chaotic renovation demos. It arrived in the stillness of a private room, seated beside the woman he has loved for more than 2 decades, listening to words that no amount of optimism, energy, or determination could undo. Chip Gaines has always been the loudest, most kinetic presence in any room he entered. The man who could swing a sledgehammer with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed every broken wall was the beginning of something beautiful. The man who turned his personality into a brand, his marriage into a movement, and his small-town Texas roots into a media empire that stretched from Waco to living rooms across the world. To millions of fans who followed the journey of Fixer Upper from its earliest HGTV days, Chip was the counterbalance to Joanna's quiet grace. Impulsive where she was measured, loud where she was thoughtful, and seemingly unbreakable in a way that made everything feel possible. But the man the world thought it knew has been quietly disappearing. And the reason is not a business dispute, not a network falling out, and not the fatigue of a man who simply burned too bright for too long. The reason is Joanna, the woman who has been his partner, his anchor, and the truest version of home he has ever known. And what she has been carrying, what they have been carrying together behind closed doors, has changed Chip in ways that no camera has captured and no headline has adequately told. To understand the weight of this moment, it helps to understand the road that brought them here. Joanna Gaines has lived with the consequences of a back injury that dates all the way back to her high school cheerleading days. A basket toss gone wrong left her with painful herniated discs that she has been managing ever since. It is a detail that sounds almost too simple to carry this much consequence. A teenage girl, a single moment, a split second of physics working against her. But that injury became a quiet thread woven through every chapter of her adult life. It followed her through the early years of marriage, through the grueling pace of building a business from the ground up in Waco, through 5 pregnancies, through the relentless demands of filming season after season of television, and through the construction of one of the most recognizable lifestyle brands in modern American culture. Joanna had her first microdiscectomy in 2001, and then underwent the same procedure again at the end of 2022. That second surgery came at one of the most demanding moments on their calendar, the holiday season, in the middle of a professional schedule that showed no signs of slowing down. She posted a photo from her hospital bed at the time, holding up a peace sign in a hospital gown, explaining to the world that she had been dealing with this injury ever since that cheerleading accident years before. It was a moment of remarkable transparency from a woman who had largely kept the full extent of her physical struggles private. And yet, even then, the world moved on quickly. A surgery, a recovery, a return to the schedule. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. But patterns, no matter how long they hold, eventually break. In January 2025, Joanna shared publicly that she was feeling stronger than ever, announcing that she and Chip had begun working with a personal trainer months earlier. She described pushing through the mental and physical barriers that her back injury had built over the years, writing that she had finally gotten over It's Too Hard hump and was celebrating a milestone she had never thought she would reach: 50 push-ups, done on her own terms, on her own timeline. It was the kind of update that fans celebrated as a victory lap. The Joanna they had always admired, refusing to be defined by her limitations, turning a struggle into an inspiration. And in many ways, it genuinely was exactly that. But what the public update could not fully contain was the fuller picture of what living inside that recovery had looked like, or what it continued to cost her day after day. Behind the optimistic post was a woman who had spent years learning to manage chronic pain around a schedule that was never designed to accommodate it. Behind the milestone celebration was a body that had been pushed further and harder than most people would ever understand, by a woman who was constitutionally resistant to asking others to slow down on her behalf. Chip saw all of it. He had always seen all of it. But it is one thing to witness someone you love managing pain with grace, and another thing entirely to sit in a room and hear a doctor reframe what that pain has meant, and what it might still mean going forward. The couple had just come through an extraordinarily full professional period. Fixer Upper had premiered on HGTV back in 2013 and ran for 5 celebrated seasons before they made the decision to walk away and chart their own course. What followed was an expansion that moved at a pace even their most devoted fans struggled to keep up with. The Magnolia Network launched in 2022. Magnolia Market at the silos in Waco grew into a 5-acre destination with shops, a bakery, a coffee shop, and a restaurant. A boutique hotel opened in 2023 after they renovated a historic Waco property. Vacation rentals, a magazine, multiple best-selling books, a furniture line, and a home collection for one of the country's largest retail chains. It was, by any honest measure, an empire. One built on the daily output of 2 people who had decided, years ago, that they would simply never stop building. That pace was always going to demand a reckoning. In the summer of 2024, Joanna openly discussed scaling back their involvement in the Magnolia business, and the couple took a genuine 3-month break to step away from the machine they had built and prioritize something that had quietly been getting less than it deserved: their family, their home, their own foundation. Chip, in discussing that period, acknowledged something quietly significant. He said the pace of their professional life had become a whirlwind so complicated that it had grown hard for the 2 of them to simply coexist within it. Those were not the words of a man who was mildly tired. They were the words of a man who had been watching the cost accumulate for a long time, and who had started calculating a debt he was no longer sure he could justify letting grow. The sabbatical was real. The reset was genuine. And yet even that pause carried within it the energy of people who intended to return. They stepped back to regain their footing, as Joanna described it at the time. Not to let go, but to hold on more securely before the next push forward. What no 3-month break could fully address, however, was what was happening inside Joanna's body. The chronic nature of her back condition meant that rest and recovery were never clean, linear processes. She had spoken before about the way her back had a habit of reminding her, sometimes forcefully, when she had forgotten the lessons her body was trying to teach her about balance and stillness. But there is a meaningful difference between the body issuing a warning and the body demanding a complete rewriting of the terms. And as the months moved forward and the symptoms continued to make themselves known in ways that were harder to manage and harder to explain away, the conversations between Chip and Joanna became more serious, more private, and more weighted with a fear that neither of them wanted to name out loud. The medical conversations that followed were not the kind that end with a simple course of treatment and a clean return to normal. They were the kind that require a couple to sit together in a new kind of silence and ask themselves, with complete honesty, what is actually non-negotiable in their lives, and what they have been treating as essential that is, in reality, only optional. Every future project, every commitment already made, every expansion still sitting on the drawing board, all of it had to be measured against something that could not be managed by a production schedule or delegated to a team of talented executives. For Chip, the internal shift that followed was profound in a way he had no real vocabulary for, because it asked him to become someone he had never needed to be before. The man who had built his entire identity around momentum, around the forward thrust of always making something new and always moving toward the next horizon, was being asked to stop. Not pause. Not scale back strategically. Stop. And to understand, perhaps for the first time at this depth, that the greatest thing he had ever built was not a television show or a network or a market in downtown Waco. It was the life he and Joanna had made together. And that life now required his full and undivided presence in a way that left no honest room for anything else. Those who worked alongside him began noticing changes that were subtle at first and then increasingly unmistakable. The energy that had always made Chip the engine of every room he walked into became quieter. Decisions he once made with the reflexive confidence of a man who had never seriously doubted his own instincts slowed down, becoming more careful and more deliberate, as though each one was being measured against a question he was always asking privately. The humor that fans and colleagues had come to rely on as his default mode was still present, but it sat differently now, closer to the surface of something more serious, like a habit he reached for when the situation seemed to call for it rather than a natural expression of how he felt. He began clearing his schedule in ways that producers and business partners did not initially understand. Meetings were shortened or cancelled altogether. Future projects that had been in early discussions were quietly shelved. Conversations about new seasons and new expansions that had been progressing naturally were allowed to simply go cold without any formal explanation offered. To the outside world, the narrative that circulated was vague, exhaustion, perhaps, or the cumulative weight of years of public scrutiny and controversy that had followed them through the highs and lows of nearly 15 years in the spotlight. It would have been easy, and not entirely inaccurate, to assume that the noise of those controversies had simply worn down a man who had spent years standing in the middle of it all. But that was not what was happening. What was happening was far simpler, and far more human. Chip Gaines was choosing his wife. Not in the abstract, performative way that public figures sometimes announce their priorities when the cameras are watching and the narrative seems to call for a moment of noble declaration. But in the daily, unglamorous, completely private way that real love actually operates when it is being asked to carry something heavy. In the mornings when getting through the routine required more effort than the day before. In the appointments that had to be kept and the adjustments that had to be made without complaint. In the moments when the most meaningful thing he could possibly offer was simply to be present, without an agenda, without somewhere else to be, without the restless forward pull of a man who had spent decades believing that standing still was the same thing as falling behind.